there's a very clear lineage. We should definitely get back to KPFA and start from the beginning. There's definitely a clear lineage from Lewis Hill, the real founder of KPFA, and his vision for the radio station. There's a clear lineage from him to like Amber Frost on Chapo saying like, we're doing propaganda, like we're creating the revolution, like with our stupid show, you know. There's a very direct line from what he envisioned to the reality that we live in now, where people think that they're doing Marxist-Leninist practice through their podcast that is going to create a revolution. And a lot of the time, in fact, there's sus aspects to that you can draw out in this history. These ideas aren't free of their dark side.
That's the thing. That's really what we're going to get into today is the how did KPFA become the alternative, and what did that entail, and who helped them get there, and what kind of compromises did they have to make in their formative decades to become that alternative hegemon. And I think, as we'll find out, some pretty yikes compromises had to be made that I think that ended up being inextricable from the rise of alternative media itself. And I think perhaps provides a little more perspective and a guide into how we should look at things like alternative media in general, and perhaps exercise a little bit more revolutionary skepticism about some of these things.
Yes, and in fact, I think there definitely were compromises, and there were breaks within the organization and rifts and fractionalism within it, but also there were some things from the very beginning, from the inception, that are a bit off about this project. Because one of the big things, I think, is that when you hear Pacifica Radio, you might think, oh, it's called Pacifica because it's started in California and there's the Pacific Ocean. But that's not why it's called that. It's called that because it had an ideological commitment from the very beginning to pacifism, which doesn't sound weird, really. It sounds good. Like, everyone loves peace, you know. I'm from the religion of peace. As we all know, that's what Islam is, the religion of peace. And but you know, everyone likes the idea of peace. FDR even said that all Americans are pacifists, as someone quoted in one of the books.
And to be fair, everybody from Nazis to members of the Comintern not the Nazis themselves, but people who maybe were German sympathizers or Nazi sympathizers in the U.S., everyone across the American political spectrum, from liberals to conservatives to Marxists to pacifists to fascists, they all kind of had a kind of non-interventionist pacifist orientation, or at least claim to on the surface, and it was described in this book that we're going to go. It was
they go to war unless it's necessary. In theory,
of course,
you know, it's every war is necessary in theory. You know, obviously they're not all true, but you know, if you're a pacifist in World War II, there are sometimes people who there's ideological adjacencies to that, which are obvious, perhaps, if you think about it for a second. You know, some people maybe are just naive and they just want to, be peaceful, or they're Quakers or something. And then there's people who have other motives for wanting to be pacifists in World War II as Americans.
People that didn't want us to wage war against the Nazis,
and destroy the best of our race in a pointless conflict. This
is the kind of the Charles Coughlin, America First, the Silver Shirts, that whole kind of a network of people. But basically, just to ground this, in the 1930s, a lot of people were pacifists, but as the book we're going to draw from, which is by Matthew Lazar, I think is his name, which was, what was the name of it? It was The Rise of Pacifica Radio?
Yeah, it's The Rise of Pacifica, I think. It was from the 90s, and he wrote another short
Pacifica Radio, The Rise of an Alternative Network, that was published in 1999. Pretty good resource and a good dissection of what these competing kind of like the kind of ideological motivations behind the beginning of it, and like how that really kind of got interestingly twisted around. But also, you're right, there were some seeds of weirdness in the very beginning. And Lazar says that while pacifism was widely embraced by almost everybody in the 30s, by the time World War II started happening and the Nazis invaded Poland and then Western Europe, and then particularly when the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, that was a big moment where all of the socialists and communists basically abruptly abandoned pacifism, which is something that Lewis Hill, the founder of KPFA, would like never forgive them for. Which is kind of like funny. It's just like, yeah, like it was just like the ultimate betrayal to him that these Marxists who he was already leery of would they weren't really committed to pacifism because like the most vicious genocidal death machine in history was like invading the only socialist country, and they wanted to resist that. So I guess that made them evil and authoritarian. But then, he found himself like kind of a bit of a loner at that point, because especially after Pearl Harbor, because then all the liberals, the conservatives, even a lot of right-wing folks basically got on board with the war effort, and it became almost like the constituency absolutely like fizzled out by 1942, and so we're going to go through the history here, but yeah. I think before we go any further, it's very important to note who Lewis Hill was and where he came from, because it's kind of a recurring theme throughout KPFA.
An interesting fact, just to give you a picture, like before we move on from this, from Matthew Lazar's book, he writes that pacifists, like including Lewis Hill, often regarded stories about Nazi atrocities as anti-German propaganda. Similar to false stories circulated during the First World War. So they were like, that's all from Adrian's Ends. They were like all that stuff about, in speeches, Must,
not the best take in retrospect.
A.J. Must who's the most prominent American pacifist. He reminded his audience that European powers had failed to negotiate a just peace after the First World War, and that Hitler's racism was hardly unique, since England and France also justified their imperial conquest with racist ideology. That is true. Another total war would exhaust Europe and elevate the United States, also a racially segregated society, to imperial superpower status. Not wrong, but still also a little bit cynically deployed. Finch,
exactly.
Hill, and others thought that a war with Germany would simply set the stage for a much larger conflict, a showdown with the Soviet Union. We were very clear on this point. It was a way by which we would be led into war against the communists. They also feared that during the war, civil liberties would be suspended as they had been during World War I. Must called for pacifists to press for a negotiated settlement between Germany and the Allies. He used diplomacy to drive a wedge between Hitler and the German people. There is no cheap and easy way out, he argued, but the assumption that German people are a special breed of semi-humans who do not react to love and hate, good and evil, as do other men, is patently without foundation. It's funny because, it's interesting some of the takes about Stalinoids that would...
I was just thinking of Dwight MacDonald and, the guy, his friend having to tell him, clearly you don't see communists as human beings anymore, and you just think we should exterminate them.
Right.
Yeah, Dwight MacDonald, not going to come out... If there's any mass cult and mid-cult fans out there, which I used to be kind of a fan of that book, but now just reading through this, I was like, I'm gonna burn his book. Like, fuck this guy. Like, he's such a fucking asshole the whole time. Just like, the Stalinoids. Like, ugh. Anyways, okay, but who was Lewis Hill? How did this guy end up, being such an eclectic idealist that he thought that, the Allies and the Nazis could just break the sword? Interesting.
He literally thought that they should break the sword and, use mind war to fight the real enemy, which is war.
Yeah. I think he literally said so. I highlighted something that Hill said in this book that sounded exactly like Mind War. I think it was Hill that said it. There was something around the lines of we need to understand that the enemy in war is not the opponent. The enemy is the problem or something. We just need to attack the problem, instead of attacking each other. It's sounds very much like Mind War, which is not totally unrelated to all this.
Right. Yeah. I don't know what this quote is from, but it does associate it with Lewis Hill. It's both in the months following Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, both men went to CO camps, concentration objector camps, out of strong convictions about the nature of violence. They agree with Must, reflecting the teachings of Gandhi that, so I guess A.J. Must said this, your real enemy is not a person, someone whom you can shoot and thus solve your problem, but learn behaviors that could be unlearned through example. So, yeah, Lou's attitude was that modern war so far exceeds all talk about traditional honor and right and wrong that it becomes ridiculous to even deal with it in those terms, Finch later said. Although Hill could have easily gotten an F4 status, medical exemption, he registered as a conscientious objector and went to Colville. Which was conscientious objector camp. So
and that's where the germ of this idea would start. But before we go any further, again, who is Lewis Hill? How did this weirdo get so wrapped up in like the idea of pacifism? You know, what really drove him? You know, is this something maybe in his background or something? Well, let's look into his background. And you know, I mean, I think this is interesting in light of what some people on Twitter have said over the years about like certain podcasters, and maybe they have certain, you know, backgrounds that are a little more elite connected despite their Marxist politics and all that stuff. So Lewis Hill had been born on May 1st. That's very ironic, on May Day, 1919, in Kansas City, Missouri, to a pair of, quote, empire builders, as his wife, Joey Cole Hill, once put it. His father, Johnson D. Hill, a lawyer, had moved from Missouri to Tulsa in the Oklahoma Territory. While visiting the city of Bartlesville, he met and married Laura Phillips. Laura's older brother, Frank Phillips, was soon to become the living symbol of the self-made Southwest oil millionaire. A one-time singing barber who married into a prosperous Iowa banking family, Frank Phillips had taken advantage of the breakup of the Oklahoma Indian Territory to obtain fields rich with oil. Talk about Reed settlers. By the late 1920s, the Phillips Petroleum Company, with its chain of Phillips 66 gas stations along legendary Route 66, had become a byword for Jazz Age prosperity. Johnson Hill, Lewis's father, also went into the oil business, and later he bought an insurance company. Young Lewis grew up in an atmosphere of sudden wealth. He spent time at his uncle's majestic ranch in Bartlesville, and this is interesting, where Frank Phillips entertained the likes of Hollywood cowboy Tom Mix, Herbert Hoover, and evangelist Amy Semple McPherson. The famous mansion was noted for its halls filled with medieval sculpture and Frank Phillips' gigantic study. In a letter to a friend, Lewis once described his home life as combining, quote, corporate wealth, romantic ladies, and unlimited scotch and soda. So I just want to add the note in there. Tom Mix, that was a guy who popped up a lot in McGowan's Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon book. I want to say that he was the one that owned the log cabin that Frank Zappa moved into in the 60s. Yeah, so I mean, I'll double check that later, but definitely because you don't forget a weird name like Tom Mix, and I guess you know he was one of the sus lords of like the early like the Hollywood golden years and whatever. But anyways, to the young Lewis Hill, he encountered pacifism, and then I guess he believed that these ideas proved that one did not need a socio-scientific plan like Marxism or liberalism to make a better world. One simply needed to believe and act accordingly. Quote, the mere conception that reality and present being consist in paradox, Hill wrote, and the dialectical proof that the only possible movement through paradox is a leap, are like a clean broom. All manner of positivist, phenomenalist, humanist rubbish is swept out, and the way is empty. Hill drew from, this is when he was at Stanford, I think reading a lot of Kierkegaard, who he was obsessed with.
He loved Kierkegaard, yeah.
And of course, he went where else? Stanford University, and he drew from his studies at Stanford a deeply optimistic belief in the power of the individual to reconstruct human relations. The foundation for this view, and later for his vision of listener-supported radio, was Kierkegaard's contention that one's relationship with others, like one's relationship to God, was based on a willfully constructed self based on faith. Thus, in a sense, one created human reality as one created God. After reading Martin Buber's I and Thou, Hill wrote to Finch, I think it was his friend he met in the CO camp, the real crux of the matter is, as Kierkegaard saw it, that an implacable paradox arises in the absolute existence of thou through the cognitive act of I. The paradox can only be lived subjectively. And he said sometimes this ideology, which placed so much primacy on, quote, inward nature, made Hill's friends nervous. A, quote, philosophy for desperados, Finch once said of Hill's interpretation of Kierkegaard. And, he also, a funny quote here, many things, fantastic things, become possible through the definite determination to remain definite, Hill concluded. Quote, Zionism and the Gandhian movement have always had this specificity. He also, somebody else named
awesome.
Right?
Thank you.
Yeah, very, very cool.
For access to the full-length episode, subscribe to the Hour of Frequency at patreon.com/subliminaljihad.